Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second of LBDA's 2023 Community Webinar Series. My name is Julia Wood, and I'm the Director of Professional and Community Education here at the Lewy Body Dementia Association. Throughout the remainder of 2023, LBDA will be hosting a series of webinars on a variety of topics, including vision changes in LBD, disease-modifying treatments, and palliative care, just to name a few. These topics have been selected based upon the needs identified in calls to our Lewy line, questions in our online Facebook groups, and in our support groups. Before I introduce our first presenter today, I would like to tell you a little bit about the Lewy Body Dementia Association. We are a 501c3 national nonprofit organization that was founded 20 years ago by care partners seeking support and answers to their questions, probably a lot like yours. LBDA's mission is dedicated to advancing awareness, research, education, and support for individuals and families living with LBD. To learn more about how we can help, visit our website at lbda.org. Now, a few housekeeping items. You're welcome to submit your questions anytime using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Following the presentation, our presenter will take questions for about 15 minutes. This webinar is being recorded. We've had a lot of you ask that, and an email will be sent to those who registered in about 1 week with a link for the recording as well as other resources. Also, when you leave the webinar today, we ask that you complete a brief survey that will appear asking for your feedback about today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey to help inform our content in the future. I'm very excited to introduce our presenter today, my dear colleague, LBDA's Senior Manager of Support Services, Ms. Brandi Hackett. Brandi Hackett is a social worker, and she attained her BA from Shorter College and her MSW from the University of Georgia. Since graduating in 2004, Brandi has worked in a variety of settings, primarily with older adults. In her current role at LBDA, she supports staff, individuals diagnosed or symptomatic, care partners, and also LBDA volunteers. I have to admit, she's my go-to so many days to help support all of you with education needs. Her article on compassion fatigue was published in the Journal for Certified Senior Advisors, and she has presented multiple continuing education classes for allied health professionals. So with that, if you'd like, you can use your reactions on the bottom to give her a round of applause or a heart as I welcome Ms. Brandi Hackett. Welcome, Brandi.
Hello, everyone. Give me 2 seconds and I'm going to pull up the screen for us. Thank you, Julia, for a great introduction. And I really want to take some time to say thank you for everyone for making time for this appointment today with me for this presentation. We are really going to focus on a couple strategies and how to best effectively manage medical appointments. A few disclosures. A PowerPoint of the slides will be sent after this. And so you may notice that we have a ton of content in this presentation to share, and I may bounce around a bit on the slides or maybe not cover every single bullet on the slides as we're going through. So do know that you will receive a copy of the slide deck as well. So I don't want you to feverishly be writing notes. But just wanted to let you know that that would be shared. And I always want to share too, that we are truly as an organization committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion and research and in access to clinical care to all. By the end, these are some things that we hope you walk away with. And so we want to look at and lean into what does it mean to manage medical appointments and why is this beneficial? And really for whom should we focus and do this? What tips are going to be helpful, not only in preparation before, but during and after the appointment? And we also want to give you some resources to go to for additional questions. We aim to share real life techniques. One of the gentlemen in my Living with Lewy group shared the other day that sometimes just walking into this diagnosis felt like swimming upstream in a hurricane. So we want to do what we can to help reduce that chaos, give you some tools and tricks to streamline information and to really feel empowered as you are walking into these appointments. There is so much in this presentation and under this topic, and I'll be honest, it can be very daunting. So my goal today is to give you one or two things that you can walk away with. If you walk away with more, that's a bonus for me, but I really want us to focus on what small things we can do in this arena to smooth out this process. We also need to remember, and I think it's very critical, that we're going to speak about this almost like it's in a vacuum, but we know the reality of this. We know that this isn't juggling one appointment and one doctor. This is juggling multiple appointments with multiple doctors in multiple systems. And so it can be a lot more than this may simply appear in this one appointment discussion. We also know that there can be stress and anxiety even in the absolute best of circumstances. And even if there is impeccable planning, things can still happen. We also know that different individuals in different situations may have different challenges above and beyond some of the ones we're going to be able to talk about today. And that could very much hinge on access to providers or insurance coverage or support situations or financial means. We also know that what may work today, what may be possible today, and what may be priority today can definitely change over the course of a situation. So we want to make sure to remember that there is a bit of moving target in doing this. When I was looking at really how to start this concept, and we kept leaning into the idea of management, it really forced me to look at what management is. And this is almost management in a role or a career, but I love some of the things that it pulled out. And so a couple of the bullets on the screen are things that we're going to be coming back to throughout this presentation. So these are some objectives, what makes a good manager and what are some of the tasks associated with that. And so that is really leaning in a role to focus on what tasks and objectives need to happen, what's achievable, looking at resources, priorities, strategies, who's involved, who should be involved, strengths and weaknesses, and then again, to have that continued conversation on what success looks like. I wanted to start with some statistics on doctors' visits, and this was pulled from the CDC and the National Ambulatory Care Survey back in 2019-2020. But I thought it was really incredible stats and wanted to share with you guys. And these are United States-based stats. We made 1 billion visits to physicians, 1 billion. Half of those were to primary care physicians, about 20% were to surgical specialists, and 29% to medical specialists. We also made over 131 million visits to the emergency room in 2020, and about a third of these were due to injury. For physicians' visits, we have multiple reasons why we see them, but in this statistics, they looked at 40% was for the care of a chronic condition. So for conditions such as Lewy Body Dementia, where you're going to see physicians multiple times in the management of the same condition. 21% was for a new problem, 21% preventative care, and 15% really looking at that injury or pre or post-surgical care. So who can really benefit from this information? I'll be honest. My hope is everyone. When I was thinking about the creation of these slides and this content, I wanted it to be beneficial for those that are symptomatic or diagnosed with Lewy. I wanted it to help care partners that are currently supporting someone symptomatic or diagnosed with Lewy or other dementias. I also wanted it to be there as a future reference in case you ever need care or you ever need to provide care to someone else. Also for something that physicians and other medical providers can share as a resource to others. And I always like to throw in some content for my fellow allied health professionals to have as a resource to share with those that they serve too. I wanted to bring forth a very common quote that many of us have seen on presentations or are familiar with, and it's from Rosalind Carter. And she says simply, there are 4 kinds of people in this world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those that will need a caregiver. And so again, I'm hopeful that this information today can truly benefit everyone listening and those that you may share it with. So I have to give a little nod to my dad. Since I was a small child, he reminded me over and over, Brandi, there are 3 steps to every task. the preparing for it, the doing of the task, and the cleaning up. And I'll be honest, I've been pretty terrible at step 3, and he would remind me of that often. But this was a way that I could frame this content today. So in preparation, what can we do before an appointment? In the midst of the appointment, what can we do? And then following, how can we do that cleanup? And what can we do after the appointment happens? And if we lean in initially to the preparation side of this, what you're going to notice is we're going to spend the bulk of our time here. And if you think about a professional, let's call it a chef, most of the time in their role is spent in preparation, in the purchasing and the organizing and the planning. And then it finally gets to the point, once everything's in those tiny bowls, that they get to cooking. And so as we talk through this, you'll notice it's pretty heavy in this first part. And part of that is because there should be emphasis, and doing more in this first part can truly help the second 2 parts run more smoothly. So when we go back into those management tasks of what preparation can look like, we want to really see what those needs are and what is achievable. We want to know who's involved, their strengths and weaknesses, who may need to be involved, what can be delegated. And we want to take time to really look at our health information, prioritize what can be helpful, think through some of the symptoms that we're experiencing at the time so that we can best share that with others. So why do we need doctor's appointments? And we know that this can happen for a variety of reasons. And so when we're making an appointment, sometimes it's good to take a step back and say, why? Why do I need this? Because that also helps us determine which ologist is going to be best for that appointment. So for many, it may be best to start with your primary care doctor or general practitioner, and then that person may be able to refer to the correct ologist. But if you can look on the screen, there's a lot of reasons why we contact and affiliate and have appointments with these medical providers. So this could be new things that we're experiencing, something feeling just off or not right. It could be something we've had for some time that's getting worse. It could be a follow-up. It could be preventative care. There can just be a host of reasons that we find ourselves in this position. So you'll notice there's going to be a few tools from one specific place that I'm going to share throughout the presentation, and you will receive links to every single one of these tools. I'm going to be honest, I'm a little old school when it comes to pen and paper. One other thing that I'm going to be mentioning is I may say write down, and for many that could be pen and paper, like myself and my preference in many things, or it could be an electronic means or a certain platform that you may use to organize information. We're not going to talk in specifics about a lot of these different ways today, but just know when I say pen and paper or write this down or document it, that it could be in whatever mechanism works best for you. But this was a form, it's really sort of a thinking form. Definitely it can be something you can fill out, but for me, it gave a lot of really great points to sit back and go, what is going on? What are my major concerns? So the National Institutes of Aging has a whole series of worksheets and a certain section on their website called Talk to Your Doctor. So hopefully that'll make a lot of sense as we go through why these specific worksheets were plucked out. So why is preparation important? So as part of my preparation for this presentation, there was a very recent, oddly enough, NPR podcast that just happened about this exact subject. And they said specifically in this realm to prepare as if you were going to your accountant getting ready for taxes. You certainly wouldn't show up without receipts and the right forms. And so I think that's a great way to think about this, that in some situations we have an exorbitant amount of planning that's required, but we want to sort of take a step back and realize that this kind of organization can be helpful for this topic as well. We also know that there is a balance in this. So much in this diagnosis and these symptoms and these processes can feel a little bit like Alice in Wonderland falling down the rabbit hole grabbing for roots. So we don't want to get where we are doing nothing but this. We want to, as I like to say, set timers. We want to put this in its place. We do want to prepare, but we want to do it with the right balance. It can be extremely overwhelming. So again, I do not expect anyone to take this content today and do all of this next week. Definitely small bites throughout and small steps that you can take. So in terms of priorities, I wanted to start with this form first, and then we're going to reference it a little later again. But to me, priority is key when it comes to sitting knee to knee with a medical provider, because it is so important for us to keep our expectations realistic. Often in these very brief one-stop appointments, we have to think about quality of how much, what you're covering versus the quantity of how much and what you're covering. We do know that the time face-to-face with a provider, screen to screen with a provider is limited. So a focus can really help our own expectations of what this can look like. And it can also help the doctor meet our expectations in what they can cover at that time. It can be very important, again, to write down, document, think through, brainstorm, and prioritize a list of questions. And there's another wonderful form that's available on the same National Institutes of Aging sheet called Prioritizing Concerns to Share with Your Doctor. So this is another great place to jot notes down and to have an idea of what your aim is for those appointments. Then who should be involved? And this can be a tough decision because many times when we visit our doctor, we do that privately. But there are certain conditions and certain times where we may need to bring a buddy, a friend, a family member, or even a professional like an aging life care manager or other support to be present in appointments. Sometimes it's hard to think about what we can handle. So I encourage people to think about what can you handle on your best days and your best moments, and what can you handle on your worst days and your worst moments. Because with a diagnosis like Lewy or with symptoms like Lewy, we know that there can be extreme fluctuations in this. And so it can be hard to determine in July 7th, 2023, when you have that doctor's appointment, that how you're going to be in that fluctuation. So having someone to potentially attend those appointments with you, especially with conditions that we know can have progression over time, doing that a little earlier than may make sense can be really helpful, because it can be really hard to get that person by the collar and pull them in the middle of a crisis. And sometimes if we've gotten almost too far down the road, it can be hard and sometimes harder to admit that we need help when more is on fire. So sometimes being much more proactive in those discussions can be helpful. If you have people that are supporting you or you're supporting others, after these appointments, it's a great time to sort of have a sit down and determine, what happened and what updates are there, were there changes, so that everyone who is attending to their own needs or attending to someone else's needs and has that responsibility, even if just in an emergency, to have an idea what those updates are. And I wouldn't be a social worker if I did not say how important it is to have healthcare advance directives in place. These are typically state-based documents and procedures that you can use to document your wishes about your healthcare needs. And this can be a wonderful time and a great reminder, and also a great thing to provide doctors' offices, hospitals, et cetera, that these are your wishes and these are documented. At worst case scenario, most of the doctor's appointments will have a HIPAA form or a privacy form. At minimum, this should be completed, but we really do encourage anyone who can, and that can be often starting in the teens, to go ahead and have advanced directives in place, because none of us really are sure when we may need to utilize those documents. And sometimes when we get to the point of needing to utilize them, it may be too late to create them. So we want to make sure that we have those in place proactively. We also know that this can be a very emotional experience. Being ill, not feeling like ourselves, experiencing new symptoms, facing a potential new diagnosis, experiencing progression in a diagnosis, having increased things that you can do and can't do, having increased issues with safety and independence, having more responsibilities for care partners, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many things that can just amp up emotions around these changing needs. And so again, a reminder, empathy, compassion, and respect as much as possible, choice as often as possible. And sometimes that can boil down to something as simple as, would you prefer your blood pressure on your right or left arm? And then listen, validating, showing empathy, and then rinsing and repeating. As we talked before, this is so much of a moving target. So when we're thinking about scheduling, so we've determined what we're going, and we've determined our ologist, it can be really important to look at the providers that are available. And often a good place to start with that is our insurance network. And so sometimes networks can be limiting in terms of how they provide certain medical providers in and out of network. And we know many times it is financially beneficial to remain in network if possible. So once you determine the coverage of insurance and you identify the provider, you've read the reviews, all the things, my encouragement is to go ahead, and we're going to talk about lots more to do, but before you feel done with all of this, go ahead and make an appointment. Because what can happen with many of these is it can take a while to get into the pipeline. So let's imagine that you wait, don't make the appointment, and then you wait for everything to be in place. And then let's say you call and they say, well, we'll see you in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, depending on the specialist or provider. It could also be tomorrow, which could cause some urgency, or at least give you future things to work on with follow-up appointments. But often it is not a tomorrow appointment. And so it can be important to go ahead and have things in place and then be able to wrap the rest of this information around it. If there is paperwork to complete, most of us know we walk into a doctor's appointment or a provider's appointment, they hand you that clipboard with a stack of papers, and you're fumbling through purses and bags and finding insurance cards and back and forth numbers and addresses to your pharmacy and praying that there's Wi-Fi. You're really trying to figure all that out, and sometimes getting all of that. And in many, many situations, they can provide that to you, even if it's not on a website or a portal. Going ahead and having that completed either virtually through a portal or through paper form, and having that ready to take in with you. And before the appointment date, it's important to really see, like, how long is it going to take me to get there? What's a good route at that specific time of day for the appointment? May you need to take a detour or two? Also thinking about things like parking. And if you do need for any reason to plan any kind of alternative transportation, doing that as soon as possible to make sure that you get in their books and then confirming closer to the appointment date. Also, if you have that buddy or person that's meeting you at the appointment, making sure that they know real specifics about the time and the date, and of course, any changes or updates to that, but location information, and that can get as specific as the doctor's name or the suite number, because we know many doctors are in either hospital settings or large medical practices, and so having some specifics on that can be really helpful. In terms of scheduling considerations, with Lewy and symptoms of Lewy, we know that, again, incredible fluctuations can happen. And for many, there can have predictable moments in this. So the person may say, the later the day gets, the harder it is for me. Or they may say, I don't do mornings. Can't do mornings. Was that Garfield? I think there was a comic strip that always says, I hate mornings. And so looking at time of day, if there are multiple slots available to sort of position that. It may also be before or after a meal. And of course, making sure that you're checking in if there's any fasting or anything necessary for lab work. It's also important to let them know if there are any accommodations that are going to be helpful for that appointment. And that could be language interpretation. That could be certain mobility-based limitations. It may be having a wheelchair available to be received at the curb so that the care provider or care partner can use that to help with transferring from one place to the other. There may be special parking that's available or disability-specific parking that's available. So it's important to know those things. Also, if you have things to inform the doctor of before. So if there's things that you just want to share, making sure that you know, how do I let the doctor know of a couple things that I'd like to address in the appointment, or a couple concerns that may be difficult to share face to face. Also looking and knowing if telemedicine is an option. And so for many, this may be an option for things like follow-ups or prescription refills or referrals to specialists and things like that, or there may be a nurse line available or things that can be done telephonically as well. And so this is extremely important because we want to make sure that, especially if there are mobility issues or cognitive limitations, that we are trying to make the system work for us as well. In terms of gathering information, and we're going to talk about a lot that we can gather. But the hope and the purpose of this is once things are well organized, the best we can, it gives us space in those appointments for focus and conversation. It also gives us a quick place to reference. So unlike fumbling through all my purses and bags, like we just talked about, I've got a little folder, electronic folder, that I can easily access a medication list or surgical date or the most recent UTI. But having that, again, just makes it an easier reference, which reduces the stress rate overall for everyone involved. It can also give us more time, because if you think if the time is already limited and we take 5 minutes to fumble, that's 5 minutes we could be gifted back. And so again, using those tools to set the priorities for discussion. And I always try to emphasize the same way that I ask for grace from those that I serve is all of us, especially our medical providers, are humans providing human care. And so the more that we can keep humanity as part of this discussion, knowing that they have lives and troubles too outside of this, they have limitations and expectations too, they have full schedules and all of the like, we want to make sure that we're respecting and being as considerate as conscious as we can to help best facilitate these conversations. So what can be helpful to pull this together? It's often called a personal health record. And again, you're going to get the slide, so we're not going to focus on every single bullet, but this is the kind of content that can be very important for people to pull together. It makes a lot of sense for the person that's experiencing symptoms. So that may be where you start. But I have a very strong recommendation that you do it for both in the dyad, if there's a care partner involved, or even if you're an adult child or another person. We really, truly never know where someone needs to run in and swoop in. And it can be very, very hard to find that your doctor is Dr. Smith in the middle of a crisis. So having a go-to list of information in a safe and secure location, but a known location for those that may need to swoop in and provide care, can be helpful. And this can be an amazing reference at a doctor's appointment. We are not going to hand this whole folder over. It's too much information. But again, we're going back to the point that it can be an incredible reference. We also want to make sure that this stays up to date. And so you may time it for, some people change the batteries in their smoke detectors at the time change. So whatever you know, whether it's quarterly, monthly, after every appointment, you have a drop space. You have a place where you can continually update this information. Some information is better than no information. So again, even if you can't pull this whole list together, it can be helpful to start somewhere. So a couple of the other tools the National Institutes of Aging have provided are a family history worksheet, and this is something that can be very frequently asked at appointments and very helpful to be aware of. You'll notice that at appointments, sometimes you get these repeat questions and repeat answers, and so having that to reference as opposed to remember can be really helpful. There's also a variety of medication tracking worksheets, and it's really important to track current medications. As sometimes I say, if you take it or you put it on your skin, it's good to put it down. So we want to make sure that it's everything that's prescribed, any vitamins, supplements, holistic therapies, etc. It's also important, and I cannot stress this enough, if medications that are prescribed by the physician are not being taken as prescribed for any reason, very important to note that down. So is it cost? So let's imagine that you got a free sample, you had your prescription to go pick up, and you go and it's $1,000 copay. And you're like, I can't pay that. And you just walk away. So let's imagine your next appointment with the physician's in 3 months, but the doctor's assuming you're taking that. So if you call, they're going to be surprised. And we really don't want to wait until 3 months later to say, oh yeah, doc, I never filled it. I couldn't afford it. So it is important if there are refusals. And again, we'll go over this again a little later, but if there's any reason that that med is not taken, forgetting to take it, refusal, side effects or reactions, just important to note that. Also, former medications that you've taken, often it can be helpful to say, yeah, I took this and I had this reaction, so they changed it to X, as well as when refills are needed. So keeping an idea, because there's nothing worse than sitting in front of a doctor. That's the doctor that needs to give you a certain refill that needs a new script. And then you get all the way home and you're like, oh, I should have asked for that when I was there. So it just takes more steps. So knowing that ahead of time can be helpful. There are so many things out there on how to organize your thoughts around symptoms. There's an alphabet soup. And so as I'm pulling from all of these places and sources and articles, this is the best I could come up with. And so I just call it START. So let's start somewhere. Specifics, treatments, associated symptoms, what relieves it, and timing. So if we dig a little deeper, specifics. When did you first notice it? How severe is it? How does it affect you? Treatments. Are there meds you're on, and how are those working? Are there techniques that are helpful? How are those working? Or are you there to get said medication recommendations and or techniques? Associated symptoms or situations. I have so many people that say, every morning when I wake up, every time that happens, I also get dizzy. I had this major shift and now I have X. And so trying to see if there's associated symptoms or situations. What relieves it? What provokes it? What makes it better? What makes it worse? When is it better? What does that feel like and look like? And then timing. When does it happen? How often? And how long does it last? And this is all critical information that can really help you dig a little deeper into those symptoms and help to provide, again, prioritized information to that medical provider on the symptoms and their changes. It can also be important to know other life changes and sometimes share with a physician other life changes or systems changes that can affect your health. So this can be many of the things on the screen. So has your eating changed or your nutrition changed, your vision, your hearing, your sleep? Are there safety concerns that you have where maybe there's increased falls, or maybe a person that you're supporting is exiting the home in the middle of the night and they're finding themselves into dangerous situations or scams? There may be changes to the living arrangements, but so that could include somebody moving across the country to be closer to family, or family moving in with them, or moving to be closer to a sibling, or downsizing a home. It could be moving into a facility or a community for additional care. And all of that can shift even what pharmacy that may be used for those refills, et cetera. We also know that loss can be an incredible part of this. And I do mean losses that can be experienced through death, but I also mean losses that can be experienced through new symptoms, through divorce, through difficult relationships with family members, through changes to your job and your abilities. So there's a host of losses that can be part of this, and it is a part of your health. And so sometimes if there are key things that are happening in your life, it can be helpful to make note that this is worse because of possibly this. It can help to prioritize. It's also important, and sometimes on the front end of these appointments, especially if you are experiencing symptoms of Lewy or have a diagnosis of Lewy or are supporting someone with these symptoms, our symptom checklist on our website can be an incredible resource to help wrap our brain around things that you may be experiencing. Our website as a whole has a tremendous amount of information that you can reference, that you can help to formulate questions before your appointment. Again, we want to, let's stress on the bottom, have enough information to be comfortable, confident, and informed, but not overwhelmed. I have talked to so many individuals, and we go back to that rabbit hole where they are just free falling. And I have to remind myself sometimes, and I remind a lot of people, that the internet has no boundaries. It has no natural boundaries. So you could go and go and go and go and go for hours and look up, and you've been buried deep in information. And this can often happen when things are new. It can happen when things are changing. It can happen with external concerns. There's just a host of reasons why we sort of bury ourselves in information. It can be extremely overwhelming. There are times that it may not be appropriate information or helpful information. There are certain situations where if you have that buddy, that family member, that professional, that friend, that other person, sometimes pre-screening certain information or helping you to narrow down or prioritize can be helpful. And as we're looking at these appointments and we're looking at this information, it's really what is needed for this appointment in these moments. And sometimes if we pull back and really focus on that, that can give us at least a place to start and prioritize. So that's our preparation section. And as I told you, it's a lot. So now we're going to go into what do we do as we're doing, as we are walking in or getting very close to these appointments. So in these days and hours, we want to make sure that we have ample time to get there. There was a really exceptional website that I found called Dementia Sherpa, and it had some wonderful articles, and one was a great one on managing doctor's appointments. But she mentioned get out of the house math, basically. I don't think that's what she called it, but I thought it was pretty fascinating, and I've seen this be true. And I've had individuals that are supporting these symptoms and experiencing these symptoms say, whoa, this was helpful. So what she says is, if you imagine how long the care partner gets ready, let's double that and add 15 minutes. So that gives the individual that is experiencing changes in symptoms a lot more grace to plan, coordinate, and organize, receive reminders if needed. And if they are having tougher moments, having more space for getting ready. We also want to make sure that whatever vehicle is used for the transportation, that we have a clean truck for a walker or a wheelchair, or are able to fold it up or make sure that we can get it into the vehicle. Also, if a person is currently staying or living in a care facility or community, it can be important to let the staff know definitely ahead of time that the appointment is happening. One little trick is sometimes 15 to 30 minutes earlier than you actually need to be picking up or rolling out. It's sometimes gives a little bit more grace there. And let's say that you had forgotten to get the most updated medication list. That also gives us a little grace to say, okay, well, I'll go ahead and get that printed off to you, where you don't feel like you're running on two wheels. And in those hours and days, again, leading up to the appointment, we want to think about parking. So if the individual has access or maybe needs to plan for access to disability placards or parking placards for certain spots that may be closer, there's certain drop-off potential, but we always want to make sure if that's going to be accessible or safe for the individual. There may be valet parking. There's a host of things that can happen and a bunch of ways to do this. You really just want to see what scenario may work best for your situation. You also want to give plenty of time for things like traffic jams, finding the office, checking in. And if transportation is being arranged, making sure that that correct information is provided. One thing that I notice with that is many times people don't understand the flip side of it. So they do a lot of planning to get the person there, but they're not as clear on how do you get the person home. So making sure when you're talking to those transportation providers that you do ask, is there a number that I call when the appointment is almost over? How long of a wait should we expect for pickup, et cetera? With this as well, it's also very important to know that certain transportation providers do not do door-to-door service. They may do door-to-curb service. So I've seen many individuals, unfortunately, dropped off in the front sidewalk of this medical plaza. And if the person is managing this independently, or if they're even a care partner and et cetera managing, sometimes that's a lot on an individual. But I think there's an overassumption that it is door to door, and that is not always the case. So having some clarity around that can be helpful. Being on time, definitely, but often early. We're talking 20 to 30 minutes, depending on if you did their packet of information beforehand. If you did, gives a little bit more grace and a little less rush, but making sure that you do have time for that clipboard full of forms, et cetera, if that's something that was not completed before. Being a little early does help to reduce the stress. So if there is a traffic jam, you're not waiting last minute. And what happens is, if we come in late to an appointment, so let's imagine that we have a 10 and we're there at 10:05, we're actually taking away our own time with the provider. So we want to help the provider stay on schedule as much as possible, and we want to make sure we maximize as much time with them as possible. So being on time and a little early can be helpful. So what can we do in all that gap of time and waiting, which we know waiting can be very much a part of all doctors' appointments and all medical provider appointments. So lots of websites, which I love, plan something called a go bag. And so we'll talk on the next slide about that. So what is a go bag? It is a way to prepare for accidents, boredom, and hunger. And so in this go bag, And this can look like all kinds of bags. I've had a couple people mention literal, like small book bags, other things, but what do you put in there? So for some, whether they currently use incontinence care products or may need incontinence care products, having some of those available, wipes, disposable gloves, what they call chucks or pads for underneath in the car, etc. Some of those things can be helpful to have at hand. This may also include, in case of a spill or an incontinence accident, another change of clothing. There can also be comfort items. So I know myself, sometimes my temperature's all over the place, so I may want a sweater or a jacket. Tissues, chapstick, things that may be helpful. Sometimes something to pull my hair back. Those would be comfort items for me. Snacks and water can be helpful as long as there's permissions within the waiting room to enjoy a snack, and as well as fasting as it needed. Also, what is entertainment? So this could be an electronic tablet or a magazine, music with headphones. It may be watching that TV that's going and talking through which fill in the blank TV show is about fill in the blank home modifications at the time. So having conversation topics sort of on the ready, and then making conversation around what's around the room, et cetera, can be helped to pass the time. Also having those note-taking materials, whether electronic or paper pen. We also want to make sure that either in the go bag or near the go bag, we have our information ready. And that's going to be a copy front and back of the insurance cards or the physical insurance cards, the ID of the individual that will be seen, as well as the prepared content that we've already talked about to discuss. We also want to make sure that there's access to sensory or communication items that are going to be helpful. So this is going to be including our glasses, our hearing aids, if the individual uses a communication board with pictures, etc., making sure that those are on the ready so that we are maximizing their ability to communicate using those sensory supports. So here we go. So now we're knee to knee with the provider. And sometimes if this is our first visit, it can be helpful to introduce self, preferred name. So let's imagine that your formal name is Lawrence, but you go by Larry. It's a good time to mention that. And also mention who else could be with you. So if you have a care support person with you, whether they're, again, family or professional, introducing them as well so that the medical provider is aware of who they're speaking to. My hope is if you walk away with anything, we do focus on the priority list or priorities. So having those on the ready and sharing those with the provider, as well as having the provider and giving them an opportunity to share with you their own priorities for that time together. And it's important because we all know that so much of this is complicated by other conditions, other physicians involved, all the things, really trying to stay as hyper-focused as possible because we do know it is no surprise that this time is limited. And so we want to make best use of that time. We also want to make sure that we are in a space to support maximum understanding. So that's going to be, again, going in and making sure that we have the accommodations that we may need. Again, a language interpreter, if there's a certain volume, a certain more pitch, a certain level of eye contact. Sometimes it is just making sure that there's the right amount of distance between yourself and the person that's speaking. We also want to make sure that we have an understanding going in that very frequently now, especially with electronic medical records, there's a computer in the room with you too. So you may have your medical provider typing away, documenting some of the things that you're saying. And so I do think it's appropriate with some of the more serious conversations. If you do feel that you are sort of talking behind a computer screen, sometimes just giving a quick pause and say, you know, do you mind if I have just 1 minute face-to-face that we can chat about this? There's so much on these medical providers' shoulders and so many forced timelines, so many other expectations and other things pulling. So we do want to respect that this is part of their process, but there are times when we can ask for that focus. Also, so important, if you do not understand or have questions, to voice those. I've supported so many people that maybe they thought at the moment they didn't have questions, but after they did. And we'll talk a little bit later about what to do if questions surface after. But many people will just sort of nod their way through, or they may be at a point where they're just in shock. It's just too much. And so just making sure that you're catching the largest points of the conversation. And questions are and should be expected. These are complicated concerns. These are extensive symptoms. Again, a lot of variability, even within the diagnosis of Lewy body dementia. I talk so much about dimmer switches. It's almost like somebody's behind the scenes flipping these switches back and forth on these dimmers. And so really leaning in and asking our providers questions about what our concerns are. Again, if we have that personal medical record, it can be a beautiful reference to help answer questions as the physician is trying to get more information from us, whether it be our familial medical history or medications. It's also a great time to express if there are any religious or cultural traditions that may shift or affect the way that you need to receive care, you are fasting, certain foods that you may not be able to eat, etc. It also may affect certain treatments that you have access to, such as things like blood transfusions. So it's really a balance of your own advocacy and this partnership with this medical provider. And when we're looking at this is a tough part, but being honest matters. But being honest is hard. And sometimes that's because it's taboo or feels taboo. It's uncomfortable. It's just tough to talk about. But it's important to know that our physicians, our providers can only help us in what we tell them. So if we have things that we're not sharing, and again, this doesn't mean we're giving them the dissertation of sorts, all of our history. But if we share incorrect information, if we leave out critical information, we are sincerely affecting their ability to provide care and guidance. So we have to remember that also our physicians are incredible sources of information in a very global sense and about these taboo topics. So I made a short list to remind us. So sexual health, medical decision-making, end-of-life planning, losses and fears involving changes, concerns about family situations or history, substance abuse, safety concerns, and research opportunities. These are only a few things that the doctor may have so much information and support for you, but because we feel that those could be problematic or uncomfortable, we don't bring those up. And so it is important that honesty truly does matter, because if we look at this last bullet, once our physicians and our providers know what's really on our minds, what's really priority for us, they can help us to address these concerns head on. So what if we're there for a why? What if we're there for a diagnosis or a reason? We know that this can be hard. We know for those with Lewy, this can take time. It can also often take multiple physicians. We know that many times there may not be a clear answer in certain moments. We also know that additional testing, scans, discussions, follow-ups, providers may need to be involved. Our providers are not only looking at symptoms that help us to include, but they're also looking at every other potential cause and symptom to exclude those options in terms of the why. And so it is such a huge puzzle that they're helping you to build. There could be tests needed, and this can be a wonderful way to say, what is that test for? Or what do we hope to get from the test? Or when do we expect the results back? And once we get the results, what may we do with those results? It may be a case where there is a larger umbrella reason. We talk a lot about the symptoms of Lewy, and we say it's really hard to get to that oneologist that says, whoa, constipation and blood pressure regulation issues and changes to our memory and thinking and these sleep concerns are under this one umbrella of cause or why. And so sometimes there are these umbrella reasons for things. Sometimes answers are available at the appointment. Sometimes and often they're part of a much larger or longer conversation. Sometimes when it's really obvious to us, or we think it's obvious to us, it can be hard to go in and say, but I think I know what it is. I just need you to tell me this is what it is. But our physicians, our providers have to be really careful with this, because they want to make sure that they are taking their time and making sure that they're helping us with an accurate why and diagnosis, because that is going to help best guide. We also know with treatments that treatments and referrals may be discussed. We know that they have certain risk and benefits. We know that if medications are provided, there may be interactions, side effects, and instructions. We also know that not all conditions can be cured at this point. But we do know in many, many situations that symptoms can be managed, whether that be through technique, whether that be through other treatments, through medication regimen, etc. There's many, many ways that we can lean in to solutions and supports that are out there. We also know, like many of the other things that we've talked about, these treatment goals can change over time. And so it's important to have these constant touch points. It's also important to share your point of view with the medical provider. So if you feel rushed or especially worried or uncomfortable, sometimes leaning in and saying, I know you've got a lot of people to see, but I'm really worried. I'm really concerned. Can we take one more moment to talk about this, or one more moment to make sure that I understand? And if you notice that you've got your little list of priorities and you're getting close to the end of that time slot or that visit, and certain things haven't been covered, bring those up and say, hey, we've had a great conversation about X. I really wanted to touch base on X and Y. That could be a follow-up discussion with the social worker if there's one on staff, or the doctor's physician, or a PA or a nurse practitioner, et cetera. So there could be other people on the staff that can swoop in and help answer questions. There may be other providers out there that can help to answer questions as well. It may be that another appointment needs to be set up, or maybe a telehealth appointment could be set up. It's also important to connect to other members of the healthcare team. So a lot of time when we go into providers, we sort of look at them with blinders, but that provider may have access to many other professionals, whether it be under their umbrella there in the office or outside, that can help to build this team and help you build this team of support for you. So it may be affiliated nurses or social workers, a little biased here as one, but also other health professionals like palliative care or hospice, mental health therapists. There's a host of people out there that can sort of swoop in and help become your team and support. It's also important to know what information may be helpful for me to walk away with, because again, sometimes in that limited amount of time, we're getting a lot and we may need more time to process. But I want us to remember, there was one website that said, ask where you can find reliable and trustworthy medical information. And then they said this: anyone with a blog can give out information and advice on medical issues. So ask your doctor for trusted information and organizations, because information is important, but accurate and reliable information is far more important. And so making sure, again, we have limitless access to information now, but that doesn't mean that it's all good or helpful or beneficial or pertinent or time-sensitive information. So really leaning into the provider and saying, where can I learn more? Is there a video or a publication that may be helpful? Can also be provided a short printed summary of the visit. So this can help with certain details in terms of what was ordered, what was discussed, schedules for next appointments, etc. And as we are sharing this information, it can be helpful too to let the provider know if maybe you found a resource that might be different from the last visit. So let's imagine that you're like, oh, I found a pharmacy that delivers to our home. Please use this new pharmacy, or there's a pharmacy we use with a drive-through. Please use this update. So it can be helpful, especially in these moments, to make sure that some of those ways that you are streamlining your life that is involving your health is shared with your provider. And as we're really looking at resources and next steps, it can be helpful in those last moments to say, when do we meet again? When should I come see you again? And that could be anything from, this visit was great, done, to we're going to see you every 3 months or 6 months or 1 year. And when we know that and hear that right from the doctor's mouth, it can help us to normalize that frequency of visits. It can be important to know how best to contact the office, and where do we voice concerns, or what if we have a concern and the office is typically closed in that moment. As we know, very few things happen in business hours when it comes to medical emergencies. So what do we do with that? And then again, leaning into the doctor about building that larger healthcare team, so that it's not just the doctor as a provider to you, but what other people or services or circumstances may be supportive. And that could include nurses, it could include home health or different social workers, physical or occupational therapy, speech therapy, palliative care, dietitians, therapists. It may include exercise groups, it may include different support groups and supports that could be helpful. So again, we're looking at wide nets of support, not just one specific resource of support. We want to make sure that we're leaving with a plan. So write down, document instructions, task, a timeline, and the next appointment. So as we're wrapping up in this very last portion of our cleanup, we're really looking at what did we achieve, what resources are available, what worked, what didn't, and what success might look like in the future. We want to, at times, if possible, sometimes not on the same day, but sometimes when we are so focused on these medical appointments, let's plan something joyful, either same day or later, depending on our fatigue levels and everything else, but have something to look forward to following the appointment. And that could be a visit from a family member. It could be a nice cup of coffee somewhere, but just something that you would enjoy, that you can look forward to beyond this appointment. Once you're sort of home or in a home setting and settled, you want to make sure that those recommendations that were provided to you are also covered by the insurance, because sometimes it doesn't mean that if the doctor gives you someone or the provider, that that person is also under your insurance. So you do want to check on that. And then again, go back to the physician to say, you know what, Dr. Smith, you said that you loved him, you really trust him. I checked with my insurance and they're just not on it. Sometimes it's really helpful at that moment to go to the insurance and say, I'm looking for a blankologist. And they can help you with a list of at least providers and network that you can go back and say. It's a lot trickier than that. We're not going to get too deep into that, but just know that sometimes going back to the physician with a list of a couple options can help them to help you narrow that down. We want to make sure, like we talked about originally, scheduling that appointment pretty early. We also want to make sure just to go ahead and get things on the calendar in terms of the date for the next appointment, any other follow-up testing, further referrals, conversations, etc. And then again, update that medical record. So if you have a physical folder and it has that front pocket, just sliding that note into the front pocket, whether or not you formally put it as part of that personal medical record at that time, or you wait until your quarterly update for that. We also know that there's a lot of work between appointments. So one thing I like to remind is if we have an appointment and the doctor says, let's do this, the doctor's often assuming that this is what you're doing. And so let's say that they prescribe a medication and you get home and it's not affordable, or you're having terrible side effects, or there's refusal around taking that prescription. Again, don't wait on the next appointment to say, oh yeah, doc, you gave us that and it was too expensive to fill, so we didn't. I've had too many situations of support where, you know, if there is a concern, if there are symptoms or side effects that are problematic or disruptive, go back and say, you know, what can we expect with this? Are there other things that can be supportive? Could we change maybe the timing of the medication, the frequency of the medication? Should we come back off that increase, et cetera? But one of the things that is so critical is we never, ever, ever, in our best of efforts, want to just cold turkey a medication, that we do not have guidance from that physician on how to best come down off certain medications. There are some medications that if you take it even for a brief amount of time and you come off of it quickly, or a long amount of time and come off it quickly, it can really have a huge change to your symptom presentation. So we want to make sure that, you know, if you are coming off a med, to go ahead and let your doctor know so that they can give guidance on how best to make those changes and adjustments. We also know that what you are seeing this ologist for is a small portion of what would be considered health. So we really want to continue as best as we can to direct equal amounts, if not sometimes more, energy on continuing to move our bodies, getting enough sleep as much as possible, keeping a healthful diet, keeping connected, finding social circles of support, leaning into moments of joy, even if they're in the tiniest sips, and helping bring our stress levels, find ways to streamline this, whereas as least amount of stress as we can experience. And often it is such a combination of these successful physician visits and medical management benefits with what would be considered very good general health principles. And this as a whole has an incredible effect on our overall health. So we've made it to the end, and whew, That was a whole lot to cover in a very brief amount of time. So I hope that this hasn't left you with too much overwhelm. But again, I want to share the reminder that one or two things. What can you walk away with? So flip through the slides when you get them. What's one thing that's doable? What's a half of a thing that's doable? And really lean in and do what you can, because again, sometimes doing a little is better than doing nothing, and it can help get you closer to having things at hand when needed. As I always say, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon in many of these conditions. And so pacing yourself, whether it comes to receiving information, whether it comes to really, leaning into what this can look like for your situation and family. Sometimes I describe it as small sips. To me, I drink hot coffee, but coffee is best enjoyed in small sips. It would be pretty harmful if I tried to chug it and it was really hot. So again, just like this, small sips, 1 to 2 items. And I hope today has been helpful. I wanted to share one last slide before I turn it back over to Julia. These are the best ways to get in touch with us here and support. So we have a Lewy line, which is a helpline, not a hotline, where you can call, you leave our support team here a message, and we will respond to that message as quickly as we can during business hours and help to provide additional guidance, support, etc. Our Lewy line number is here. It's also on our website, currently at the very top of the website, and it is available and will be shared after this presentation. Our support email is another good way, because sometimes we are finding our way at that 3 a.m. email. And so just know that's another great way. It's support@lbda.org. This goes straight to the support team, and we will provide as much support and assistance as we can. I thank you all for your attention. And Julia, I'm going to turn it straight back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brandi, for such an amazing presentation. All right, so we have some great questions, and you guys, thank you for putting your questions into the chat as well. That was so helpful. And some of you have asked about different links for the resources that Brandi mentioned, and you will be receiving an email in about a week that will have a PDF of her slides from today, and also the links where you can find those resources that she discussed in today's presentation. So don't worry, that's coming to you. All right, so let's start with some questions here. And I love this first one because Brandi knows I'm an occupational therapist. And so in my clinical practice, my social work colleagues used to always laugh that no one understood what they did. They thought that when the social worker showed up that they were going to take their children away. So someone asked, my wife is diagnosed with Lewy Body Dementia. What can I expect from social work?
So social work or social workers, often many are generalist providers, which means when we come out with our degrees, and I count social workers as those who hold a degree in social work. So once we come out with our degrees, we do a lot of different things. So I belong into sort of a specialized class of what I call geriatric medical social work. So I've primarily supported people that are aging and those affiliated with the medical field. And so that's been my background. And so often social workers will gain specialization through their experience, certain licensure, et cetera. And so a social worker may come on board to help through connections, like through LBDA with our support team here. So it may be an extension of that. Like I said, your neurologist may have an in-house social worker that they can refer to. And often that is the person on the team that can help to connect to logistical support. So let's say that you need transportation resources. Let's say that you're having difficulty paying your electricity bill, or you're needing help and supports connecting to a support group or an exercise program. So we maintain that generalist perspective many times. So we're looking at sometimes what's called psychosocial needs. So things that happen really sort of outside of the prescription often, but can really affect the quality of life. So as you are asking, I do recommend asking, similar to asking for people like occupational therapists like Julia, making sure that you do ask if there's a social worker available. If there is not one within that medical unit, you are welcome to reach out at us as social workers here. You can also reach out to individuals like Aging Life Care Managements, which can be classified as social workers. And so sometimes area agencies on aging have social workers, or those working in social services that can provide us support. So we do a lot of different things. So it's hard to say this is exactly, but just know we often sort of pick up where physicians and others leave off and sort of help with those quality of life and living measures.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I keep a social worker on speed dial at all times. I encourage you all to do the same. So we had a question come in too that I think is great. What is a reasonable callback timeline when we call a provider with medication concerns?
Ooh. I personally think that this is a question for the provider. I have seen this sort of hit the target all around. I think it's important for us as consumers of healthcare to ask our providers their expectations, because for some, they have different responses depending on how we get information to them. So calling the nurse and going that way versus going through a portal versus doing this versus say, so there's different sort of paths and timelines that can happen. So it can be important to ask. And as we know, there are glitches in systems too. So I would say ask for a window as opposed to an exact. So is 24 hours reasonable? And sometimes asking a physician that, so if I reach out on the portal and my mom is having an extreme reaction to a medication and it's after hours, what's my expectation in terms of response to that? Should it be next day? Should I in turn call emergency services or some other provider to fill in that gaps? But what I find is there can be differences, but often the best source of information for that is really asking the provider what that timeline will be for them specifically.
Absolutely. And sometimes you guys too, ask if there is a different person to contact. I know in the office that I was in, a lot of the providers that were nurses that were on call, and that was really the better call to make, was to those nurse providers, and then they would handle the call, and if they couldn't, they would get through to the provider. So I think I totally agree with Brandi. You always want to ask, because there might be some things about the system that aren't so transparent that they can help you with. This is a really good question that came in prior to today's presentation, and someone asked, and there was another question similar to this today too. How frankly should you speak with a doctor in front of the patient? And so, she says her husband always hated going to the doctor and does not like too much medical intervention. So, at what point too do you advocate for less intervention?
Yeah, it's such a tightrope. I'm going to be honest. Sometimes there's ways to talk about difficult things, difficult situation, caregiver stresses, etc., through things like portals, where it is a private exchange between the care partner and the medical providers, etc. On websites and research, I've seen everything from sliding an index card across the desk with the check-in, different ways that things can be brought up. Sometimes it's important to have the doctor share things. And we know with Lewy, the level of awareness, the variety in the level of awareness is so incredible. I've supported individuals in what I would consider later stages that were incredibly aware and able to participate in their healthcare decisions and healthcare discussions. And I've spoken to individuals and families and supported families, what I would consider earlier on, where there were more complications with that. Mm-hmm. And so it can be person-specific guidance with that there isn't necessarily a, this is the amount, don't cross this line, and it can really depend on the person. And it may, I found in some of these discussions, there are buzzwords that we may not want to necessarily use. So I'm going to give you sort of an extreme example just to use it as an example. So most people on this call, if I said the word, that person is an alcoholic, we envision someone in our mind that person is. And that person may not be your loved one that you're thinking about, but that your person may have extreme issues, concerns, needs around that specific topic. So sometimes what we envision when it comes to saying a word like dementia or substance abuse or alcoholism or even hospice has a lot of weight to words. So sometimes thinking around. So one of my dear neurology colleagues here says one of my favorite things when it comes to cognition, she says it's a change of our memory and our thinking. So sometimes talking about things with concrete content about those changes, instead of saying it's his dementia is getting worse, his dementia is worse, but instead just talking about hey, Paul, would you share with him? I know sometimes you were struggling last week with coming up with words, or you were struggling just dealing with things that when you were under pressure. I'm going to talk to the doctor about a couple of those things. But if I forget something, chime in. So sometimes making sure that people are included. Sometimes things are beyond that. And I'm very sensitive to certain situations where there could be dangers or threats or other things involved. So sometimes those are private sidebar conversations that you do with the office to say, hey, there's a lot going on. There's stuff I need to share. There's stuff he will not share. But you need to know in order to provide the care that we need. And so it's asking, like we talked about on the timeline, asking the doctors, if there's more that we ever needed to share, how would we best do that with you? And then making sure, again, those privacy forms are signed so that there are permissions to talk as often as needed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have to admit, in my practice too, we would have a safe word sometimes with the care partner that, if they said yellow or whatever that day, then I knew they needed to talk to me privately. And I would try to find a way to set that up to where I could make sure I responded. So, I think it's just like Brandi said, so much is communication with your provider. Absolutely. This question came in yesterday, but it also relates to one that just came in. How do you get medical staff to understand the condition and respond appropriately? We had one that came in where the person's, kind of referencing like a facility, but I think that could also be even in an outpatient setting. So any words of wisdom?
For me, it goes back to not only the right information, but the correct amount of information. So a lot of people go in and they literally, and I wish I could show this pile of paper on my desk right now, but they go in with a stack and it's like, doctor, you obviously don't know what you're doing. Here's stuff for you to know. Sometimes boiling it down to something simple, maybe like the symptom checklist, for example. I love the National Institutes of Health booklet that the LBDA helped to write, sharing, basic content. I've been in much of my career on the other side of this. So as a hospice social worker, as a nursing home social worker. So what we can do in support here is we can help you build, sometimes I refer to it as the facility pack, information that might be key in certain situations. Hey, slide this across the table or highlight this one section as you're talking. There may be a great, we'll call it training video or short video that can be shared, hey, and it's often approaching that information. So how would we want approached? If there wasn't something that we weren't as familiar with, how would we feel most comfortable in receiving information? And that's, I can guarantee by not a nod that I can see, but I know that I can feel, none of us feel great when we feel stupid or when we feel behind when it comes to information. So if we present in a way, hey, I'm not sure what you may have access to. I just found this really cool thing on X, and sliding it across the table and making sure that you are not only narrowing down what you're sharing, but then you're wrapping yours or your loved one's content all around it. Because I could say all the time that I'm having constipation as a symptom that I'm experiencing. But if I'm not sharing the how it affects me, that's very different. And so sometimes it's coming back and saying, this is the information that I think is mission critical. And this is what I can share in a way that is gentle and encourages good communication and shared knowledge so that everyone in this space together are making the most informed decisions that they can about certain conditions.
Absolutely. And for those of you in the audience that aren't aware, Brandi's referenced a couple of times our diagnostic or comprehensive symptom checklist. And so these are documents that you can download on our website to where you can take that into that doctor's visit and have checked off the different symptoms that your loved one is having. It can be helpful as far as tracking new symptoms or the diagnostic one. It can be helpful in them to help them diagnose the condition as well if you're having trouble that way. So those are some great free resources you can access on our website. Another question here, and this will probably be, we might have time for one more after this. What do you do when the patient refuses to go to the doctor's appointment?
I'll be as quick as I can with this, but we are in another tricky situation. And often this is so person specific of the why. That's probably the first question I ask is why. So is it something that's you're aware of? Is it fear? Is there a lot of fear in having a why? Is it a fear of physicians? Is it that white coat syndrome? Is it, I've talked to 4 physicians and no one told me the right thing or what I think is correct or helpful? Many times there's a why behind what I'm going to call the refusal of the pushback. There's also a lot of opportunities to bring healthcare to us. And so there can be times where I always say, let's look at the path of least resistance. So if that is a primary care doctor, for example, in many situations, I will hear, oh, that Dr. Smith, he loves Dr. Smith. Now he will never see Dr. Jones, but Dr. Smith is the one, and so using that daughter that is the golden child, using other things. And sometimes I'll be honest, our hardest appointments can be around our thinking or our memory changes, or sometimes psychiatric symptoms or altered perceptions that we're having, hallucinations, delusions. And so sometimes if you are supporting someone that's having these more global changes to things that they may be embarrassed or most concerned about, sometimes using, I'm going to call it a golden opportunity in terms of a physical change, can get you into the door so that those discussions can happen. So sometimes if there's a fall, and I hate to ever wish any situation like that, but a fall or a hospitalization, other things may be an opportunity or a path. There are sometimes when your hands are a little tied, and those are really, really tough moments, but those are beautiful times as well, especially as care partners, to set up safety nets, because there's going to be times when pushback, there's just not something you can do in those moments, but you can use that time to know, okay, if the other shoe were to drop, what things can we quickly put into place there in those moments? And so having some of that on standby can be helpful, but those are so tricky and so hard, and we will support as much as we can, but it's often very person and situation specific.
Absolutely. I was going to say too, I worked in the Philadelphia area and we had some pretty choice, like, cheesesteak spots and stuff around us. So we had several patients that they would come if there was cheesesteak involved, or if there's some kind of a reward at the end. So they weren't really coming to see us. They were coming for the cheesesteak after, but we'll take them. Yeah. And this one question, Brandi, I wanted to throw out, and I can jump into, because this really reminds me of a client that I had with Lewy. So ultimately, is it reasonable or possible to expect one provider, she's saying, for example, the neurologist, to oversee all meds and possible interactions? So she's having difficulty with her husband's care jockeying between neurology and cardiology. And so, these cognitive and autonomic system changes. So she's like, who's in charge?
One piece of this I don't think we talk enough about is sometimes the providers need to figure out where that line is. I think we just talked about this in support group a couple of weeks ago, we often think it's our responsibility to judge those lines in the sand. But one thing that I have seen is sometimes just saying, hey, I've got 2 docs involved. Who's doing what? Can you guys chat or figure out amongst yourselves that X doctor is going to do these things and Y doctor is going to do these things? And then that can even highlight gaps where you need to maybe bring in another neurologist or another support that they're not providing between the two. But because Lewy, and I'm going to let you jump in, Julia, but because Lewy affects so many different symptoms in different ways, it can be important at times for the neurologist to lean in on the expertise of another doctor. But that definitely works best when they are working. It's best in tandem as possible to balance that, because we definitely don't want Dr. A to change something, Dr. B to change it back, Dr. A to change it, because that just really can wreak havoc on the body and mind as well, plus can just be very disruptive. And it's hard then to find the truth as a consumer of healthcare. Who do you trust in those moments? And so sometimes forcing that conversation up and having them discuss in the air can be more helpful than you trying to manage what that looks like.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I ended up in the middle of a situation like this in my clinical care days. And a gentleman was put on anti-Parkinsonian medication by a movement disorder specialist. And then a cognitive neurologist took him off of it with some pretty bad side effects. And so trying to get those two to communicate was very difficult, but that's essentially what I had to do and really advocate for the spouse to do, was to get them to talk, because essentially the movement disorder specialist, he needs to go back on the medication. Well, how are we titrating? What's the schedule for that? What does that look like? So you may have to kind of force that communication at times, unfortunately, and kind of be in their bonnet, I guess, for lack of a better word, to really get that attention that you need. So thank you all so much for your questions. Thank you, Brandi. Let's give her another round of applause here.
Thank you.
Such a great
It's
presentation.
my honor.
So many incredible resources. Thank you so much. And so for all of you out there, thank you for your questions, but we're out of time. On behalf of the Lewy Body Dementia Association, I'd like to thank you all for your time and attention today. And so you're given all this great appreciation for her presentation. I really appreciate that. As a reminder, once again, you're going to receive an email in about a week with the link for the recording for this presentation, as well as the links for resources that were included in today's session. We invite you to check the events calendar frequently. So if you go to our webpage, to the home page, and go to the bottom, you'll see our events calendar, and that's where you can find how to register for those upcoming events. So just a reminder, mark your calendars for our next webinar, which is going to be Wednesday, August 16th. We hope you all have a fun July and get some summer fun out there. So at noon, we're going to have a special 2-hour webinar. So the amazing clinical team from our University of Colorado Research Center of Excellence is going to address one of the most complex and highly misunderstood symptoms of Lewy body dementia: changes to vision. This session is going to feature presentations by a cognitive and movement disorder specialist neurologist, Dr. Samantha Holden, a neuro-ophthalmologist, Dr. Victoria Pellick, an optometrist, Dr. Erin Van Dock, and an occupational therapist, Karen Hookstadt. So as a reminder, please take a moment to complete the survey when you log off today to help inform our content in the future. And we hope to see you all again in August. And I thank you all again for your attendance. Thanks so much.